Hello, everyone. I know I'm competing with two other rooms, but I know there's thousands of you somewhere there in the virtual space listening to this presentation. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you about HTA. And I probably know that many of you that come to this conference are not that aware of what health technology assessment is all about. So if you think about the title of this presentation, what have we learned from the pandemic for health technology assessment, it's worth just reminding you what HTA is all about. And I'll do that in this presentation as well. So I guess at the start of the pandemic, the question for many working in this field was to HTA or not to HTA. I guess that was the question. A very famous man posed that question many, many years ago in the United Kingdom. But the answer depends on what you define as HTA. And perhaps this is for those that are not working in this field quite useful to remember that HTA, Health Technology Assessment, is a multidisciplinary process that uses explicit methods to determine the value of health technologies, which is very poignant in the context of today's conversation, at different points in its life cycle. So HTA is not just at the end of a life cycle where a technology is introduced in the market. You can do HTA at many points while a technology is being developed and when the technology is in the market. And the purpose, importantly, is to inform decision-making in order to promote an equitable, efficient, and high-quality health system. So HTA is really a foundation to many of the things that people decide to do in healthcare systems, and be it around medicines, medical technologies, digital technologies, diagnostics, procedures, all of that is HTA. And this definition was formulated by INATA, a global organization of HTA groups. Now, with the pandemic in mind, the question, do you do HTA or not, when there is so much else happening in the healthcare system, led to many of the global HTA community to put their efforts in different aspects of HTA. So quite a number of organizations, and this is from a survey by INATA, were supporting the actual research effort. So they were supporting trials that were done specifically looking at diagnostics, but also devices and drugs for COVID. Many organizations engaged in horizon scanning. So thinking about what might be coming, what could be the technologies of the future for COVID, and how can we help them enter the market. Some did rapid evidence reviews, and that is just the start of HTA. They informed either their own presentation on websites of organizations, or they informed guidelines. And indeed, much of the effort, I think, across the world was around rapid guidelines to help clinicians understand what they could do best for their patients in a very uncertain COVID scenario. We also, at NICE, looked at the evaluation of tests, but with many of these activities, because the market was so difficult to predict, the evidence was unclear, not much of the evaluation of tests has in the end resulted in guidance, at least not at our end. And we gave early scientific advice, again, one of the early bits of HTA, and not so much a full HTA. And that's true. There were very few organizations across the world that went all the way by collecting the evidence, assessing the evidence, deliberating with committees, and produce guidance on individual technologies for COVID. Mostly because the technologies that were introduced for COVID were often repurposed medicines. And the question about whether they were value for money wasn't that important for healthcare systems. There were some activities around tests, and I think that's an important area. Diagnostic testing, and of course now with the advent of genomic testing, is an area for HTA of particular interest. Of course, we all know that COVID brought an enormous digitalization to the way we organize and run our healthcare systems. And I think for health technology assessment agencies, this is the new world, isn't it? This is where, for us, a great focus will be. What is it in digital health technologies that we can say about their value, about how they're used, how they change and transform our healthcare systems? And there's so little known about what the evidence requirements are for digital healthcare systems, digital health technologies, that we have a lot of ground to catch up on. At NICE, we did 4 things during COVID. First, we prioritized existing work. We were a big machine producing guidance on everything that people asked us to do. And actually, during COVID, we noticed with lots of our staff at home, not used to working at home, with lots of people with caring responsibilities, that we didn't have the staff to do everything that everybody wants us to do. And so we had to prioritize. And it's actually one of the big learnings from COVID is that we're allowed to prioritize. We're allowed to say no as an HTA agency. We're allowed to say to our healthcare system, well, actually, you're asking us to do yet another thing, which would be nice to do, but no, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the time to do it. So that was one big learning and a big aspect of the way we handled the COVID period at NICE. Second was to develop rapid guidelines, and I'll talk to that a little bit more. We also launched a specific initiative called Rapid C19, which was a collaboration between NICE and other agencies in England with our regulator, our payer, and our academic institutions to try and predict what kind of medicines might be coming to the market for COVID and how we would deal with the evidence that was being collected for those. We developed evidence standards and we collaborated internationally. So there were 5 or 4, and actually it should say 5 things that we did, apologies. So first, rapid living guidelines. And what we noticed that this kind of static nature of developing guidelines, usually it would take 2 years to develop one guideline, wasn't of course in any way addressing the real important needs for doctors, nurses, other healthcare practitioners to understand what is required of them in an ever-changing system of healthcare where COVID was of course producing a lot of new insights. And those living guidelines are reacting to a dynamic, constant learning healthcare system. I think this is, of course, one of the futures of our work, is that we cannot afford to be static in the way we think about HTA and guidelines. We're going to have to think about that in a living and dynamic ecosystem. And indeed, if you forget about the detail, if you look at what we did over the last 2 years, we managed to translate the guideline development timelines of 2 years into 10 days. And we've produced an enormous amount of guidelines now at very short notice, particularly for COVID. And most of that is now in a magic app, so it's constantly being updated in a dynamic system. And the learning here is that now that we can do things in 10 days, that's therefore the expectation of our various healthcare systems. If we now say things take us a year, people look with a frown and they think, but you could do it in 10 days during COVID. Surely you can do it in 10 days as we enter in other emergency systems or indeed in current healthcare questions. The other initiative, as I mentioned, was Rapid C19. This was a research into access pathway for innovative drugs in COVID-19. And when we thought about what we could do as an HTA agency to HTA or not to HTA, we actually realized that it would be much better to start at the very beginning and to try and understand what the technologies are that are coming to the market and develop a plan for their introduction with the payer, with the regulator, and with the academic institutions that were doing the trials. And 2 of the major trials in COVID were done in the UK. And so this multi-agency initiative was to produce and to understand whether there was evidence of benefit for individual technologies. There were senior representatives from the great organizations that are handling evidence. NIHR stands for the National Institute for Health Research. The MHRA is the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. And then NICE, NHSE, and I stands for NHS England, which is the payer in the United Kingdom. And then there were Scotland and Wales involved. And we worked very closely with a specific group of professionals that were gathered together in a task force reporting to the Ministry of Health that were looking at therapeutics and antivirals. and they had specific questions about new technologies or repurposed technologies, and they wanted answers in less than 10 days often. And we reported directly to our chief medical officer, so where we would normally produce a HTA in about a year's time or a guideline in 2 years' time, here we did our work in 10 days and produced specific advice directly to the chief medical officer when we would normally produce our advice to the health system. So this was a very successful program of work, and it was complicated in its development, but we managed to introduce a number of technologies at breakneck speed into the NHS, and they're listed here. You will recognize many of those because they are the ones that across the world have been introduced for COVID. The other thing we noticed that actually, if you think about the evidence requirements for COVID technologies, be it diagnostics or medicines or medical devices, there was little known about what we would want to see in terms of their effect and cost effectiveness. So we decided early on to develop a number of evidence standards. So you see at the top the evidence standards framework for diagnostics, diagnostic tests, and that was used at standards. Those standards were used by the government to think about purchasing of tests. So we didn't in the end produce a full HTA, but at least we produced the evidence standards to help inform decision making. And similarly for medicinal products, for these pharmaceuticals, we produced a document that would be helpful for those that are developing those technologies and what kind of evidence we would be expecting. So this was used both by companies and in our scientific advice program. And finally, we produced evidence standards framework for digital health technologies, again an area where there's very little known about what is required for us to appraise those technologies. So that's an area of continuing development, of course. And finally, we decided that we can't do these things alone, and international collaboration was the only way forward. And indeed, we worked with our colleagues in Scotland, Wales, Canada, and Australia on some of the COVID work and have recently launched a continuing partnership with these countries on COVID, but on a number of other activities related to HTA. And we're very keen for others to join if they are interested in that initiative. Now, the lessons learned from all of this, as our team put those forward, is that actually, if there's an emergency and a pandemic of the nature we've seen, you're going to have to go hard and go early on what you want to achieve. So it was easier for us to say, well, we can't do these things in 10 days. Well, actually, we went for it, and it paid off. It created an enormous culture change within the organization, if anything, but it also delivered for patients. Eye on the prize means prioritize, do the things that the service wants you to do. Fleet of foot means you can change. You are flexible in the way you think about the work you do. Don't hold on to the gold-plated nature of the work we've done. And I must say, out of all the health technology assessment agencies across the world, NICE was often seen as the gold-plated organization. But we learned that that's no longer the way forward. We need to be much more agile and dynamic. Of course, you have to review regularly. If you step in early and you do your work at high speed, you're going to have to accept that you need to review that work, because otherwise you're not confident that it will last the time it might have lasted if you would do your work over a 2-year period. And this is interesting because this is for a kind of personal reflection. You have to tolerate messiness and risk. And as HTA practitioners, we find that difficult. We're steeped in evidence-based medicine. That means it's not messy, it's controlled, and we understand the randomized clinical trial environment. But this is often messy. If you are operating in a pandemic, you have to accept real-world evidence, or whatever term you want to attribute to that, and you have to allow yourself to take risks. You have to adapt sensibly and collaborate smartly. And of course, you have to harness technology. I think we are the least automated organization within many of the healthcare systems, and it's one of the things we have realized, that we have a lot to catch up on when it comes to automation. And perhaps reflecting on this morning's the presentation from Span. Be kind to each other. These were difficult moments for many of our staff to be pushed suddenly away from where they were comfortable working, and to be kind to each other was a key bit of feedback that we received from our staff members. Now, as I said, where we had to compromise, so we compressed our processes in 5 to 10 days rather than 12 to 24 months. We had no time for public consultation when we've always stood for transparency, inclusiveness, but we had no time to do that on some of these big guidelines. We couldn't consult extensively on draft work. We had to do extensive evidence searching, but we had no time for it, so we couldn't do all that. We had very limited writing groups. We couldn't do an extensive writing exercise, and we couldn't develop lots of material for the public. And in a way, that is a shame, but it was the only way to deliver on what was a clear demand from the NHS. I guess what went well was that we, in our collaborations and in the work we did with our clinicians and in our guidelines, we had a very clear shared vision about what needed to be done. And I think that's one of the key learnings from COVID, is that everybody was working for the same purpose. There was effective communication and a consistent approach. People were clear what they wanted to achieve. We had an environment in which all this was reasonably well understood. People were open. There were safe spaces organized, specifically in our Rapid C19 work. And people were professional, helpful, and responsive in the way they worked with each other. And also something that's been a major bugbear for HDA organizations when it came to information sharing in the past. Suddenly under COVID, a lot more open exchange of information from clinical trial leaders to regulators to HTA agencies and payers. When in the past it wasn't possible, suddenly all that was possible, and we capitalize on that now. And we also managed to empower much of our staff to do the right thing. So the hierarchy that was often in place in a big organization like NICE was now broken down, and the silos were broken down. So I think if you think about what COVID has taught us internally, is that these things like a shared vision, an environment in which you are able to work openly with others, information is shared, and there's an empowered staff base. Those were critical parts of a new culture. Now, if we look forward to what we can do as a HDA agency, one question is about how will we be looking at COVID technologies. And there's been a funded project called HTX, so that's Health Technology X, that's the next generation HTA, a Horizon 2020 funded project from the EU, and we were heavily involved. And in the context of that project, there's been some policy sandboxes where stakeholders in the HTA community work together in understanding what would be best practice guidance for health technology assessment of diagnostics and treatments for COVID-19. So I would encourage you to read that report. In the report you'll see, and this is very small, that one of the main challenges around HTA in COVID was around clinical effectiveness. The trials and the information that we've seen were all very limited in quality and in extent for us to make recommendations. And therefore, in this paper, they are very clearly focusing on how clinical evidence should be gathered for COVID medicines in the future. And they also make a set of recommendations specifically looking at cost effectiveness, value for money, how you would do the modeling, what would you expect for stakeholder engagement, and other important factors. So again, it's not for now to go through that, but if you follow the link to that policy paper from HTX, then you will find this report. And one of the key recommendations from the work they've done was that we should really focus on a living HTA approach. So we should think about, when we think about COVID HTA, we should think about a life cycle approach to COVID assessments, start early, and then regularly review, a bit like a living guideline. There will be many more COVID therapeutics, and we've already seen a recent number of those coming to the market. And we are no longer able to say that we're not interested in the value of those technologies. I think now healthcare systems want that question answered. And we have to accept that those decisions are needed despite the uncertainty that is inherent in the evidence base. And of course, we will have to be able to use real-world evidence where we can, because there is so limited RCT evidence available. And we are now in the midst, actually, of our first formal technology appraisal of COVID therapies. You see here mentioned in the top all of the products that we're going to look at. And this is quite a unique appraisal. We developed the economic model, or the structure of it. We'll be asking companies to provide some evidence on the effectiveness. We're doing this in collaboration with the Scottish Medicines Consortium, so this will be guidance that applies both in England and in Scotland. That is unique. We've never done that before. And so we're looking very much forward to this project, and you can follow that on our website. The other thing we I think, have clearly understood from COVID is that we're going to have to be more agile and proportionate in the way we think about HTA. And that's not just about COVID. We also know that at the same time, the number of technologies that are coming to the market, not just in pharmaceuticals, but we've heard from Professor Ward yesterday, the enormous growth in medical technologies and in digital technologies and in diagnostics. We need much more capacity to do our HTA work, but we simply don't have the people. You can give us an enormous amount of money, but we won't be able to find the people. So in order to expand our capacity, we're going to have to do things simpler, and we call that more proportionate. And we're looking at 4 ways of doing that, and they're here on the slide. More streamlined cost comparisons, pathway appraisals, paired appraisals, and appraisals with pre-specified assumptions. And actually, interestingly enough, yesterday evening when we were having dinner, I spoke to some of your colleagues from ACE, and much of what is in your daily practice is what we're now exploring. So some of the more pragmatic solutions to HTA that often organizations such as yours that are smaller need to think about, we now also have to think about, because from that gold-plated nice approach with lots of people that we could draw upon, we can't do that anymore. So we have to change, and we're very much looking forward to working with colleagues here on the implementation of these ideas. And they're here listed how we're thinking about doing those and what pilots are happening. Of course, this is all based on a thought around what is the risk to the health system, and risk is perhaps not the right word, but what is the consequence of us making a recommendation for a technology? How big is that consequence? How much does the NHS need to change? How much of the systems need to change? And that could then determine the degree to which you need to scrutinize the case as you might otherwise do. So, what have we learned about the role of HTA post the pandemic? Well, I think we're really good at collaborating with other people, and we're really good at bringing people together to support decision-making. You could almost call HTA the glue in many of the decision-making processes. And I think that is because we rely on the evidence. And we've seen during COVID that evidence is critical, and even politicians started talking about evidence. We can match speed with quality. There's a debate still to be had whether doing something in 10 days rather than 2 years, whether that will impact quality. But we are at the moment confident that we can match speed with reasonable quality in the context of the risks we otherwise might be taking by not making a recommendation. We can change the way we work, take risks and be agile. We should focus on what is useful, usable and used, and that is mostly about prioritization. We should work and think about HTA as a dynamic, living process, capitalizing on real-world evidence. We must grab opportunities of automation and digital health, And that, I think, is a really big area for all of us to show our worth. We must link up with our colleagues in guidelines. In NICE, those are very different worlds, but actually they collide in, if you think about dynamic HTA and living guidelines and learning healthcare systems, that's all much of the same. So we must work together. We cannot do it alone. Collaboration is key. And we are a people's business. Even though we're all behind these computers and looking at the evidence, this is about people. So back to the earlier comment, be kind and put the patient front and center of the work you do. So I think that it would be my menu for a future HTA role. And I hope it gives you a bit of an impression of what one organization has done. I haven't been able to look at all the other organizations in HTA and what they've done, but I'm sure they've followed the same path in their future thinking. So thank you very much for your contribution.